Okay, welcome back to our this is going to be our last video of the semester. I'm going to wrap it up, I hope, fairly quickly for you. I've used up, I think, most of the time of the time that I have, of your time that I have allotted to me. So let's cover Objective 3, which is the last objective for the last chapter that we're covering, the fiscal policy dilemma. And then I added another objective just briefly to show you in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework, the economic shutdown associated with social distancing and the COVID-19 virus and the impact of monetary and fiscal policy in that model. And just some stuff to think about over the summer. We can assess how much we can expect out of those policies. So Objective 3, to avoid the problems of direct fiscal policy, economists have attempted to build what they call automatic stabilizers into the economy. And these automatic stabilizers dampen the amplitude of the business cycle without any additional acts from Congress. So it's kind of like built-in fiscal policy that automatically kicks in without any need for political action, I guess is the best way to put it. So an automatic stabilizer is any government program or policy that counteracts the business cycle without any new government action. So it obviously can overcome a number of the problems that we were talking about under Objective 2 related to the effectiveness of fiscal policy and the political reality on the ground. So automatic stabilizers, the most important ones include the income tax. Well, actually, I guess I don't remember what order they are. Welfare payments, certainly, because welfare payments will automatically kick in. More people will qualify for welfare payments when the economy goes into an economic downturn. And that's like an automatic stimulus. And if those programs, like SNAP and other programs, are already in place, then that fiscal spending will stimulate the economy automatically without government, without the Congress and the Republicans and Democrats having to argue about exactly what that program should look like. The program is already in existence. The same is true of unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance is different from welfare payments. I will tell you that if you work, you're paying unemployment insurance premiums. So if you ever become unemployed, you should use your unemployment insurance because you paid for it. The income tax system. This is an important one. This is probably the most important automatic stabilizer because income is proportional to taxes. Say about 28% of your income is paid in taxes. If you go into a recession and you earn less income, then you automatically get a tax cut. You're paying basically not just the same percentage on a smaller amount of income, which would be an automatic stabilizer in and of itself, but there are these marginal tax brackets, and if you're earning less income, you're going to fall into a lower tax bracket and even get a lower average income tax rate, and that's all based on the current system. That doesn't require any change to the tax code. So when the economy goes into a recession, income tax collections by the government automatically go down. That's like an automatic tax cut, and it's an automatic stabilizer for the economy. So when the economy goes into a recession, welfare payments automatically go up. Uninsurance payments automatically go up for people who qualify. And income tax, both the average income tax rate, because people's income is lower than it was before, they fall into lower marginal tax brackets. And even at a given marginal tax bracket, you're earning less income, so you're taking a percentage of a smaller amount of income. For both of those reasons, income taxes are falling during a recession. All of these things will tend to keep the economy from diving into a deeper recession than it otherwise would experience. Now, I should also point out that all of these things work in the other direction as the economy recovers. As the economy recovers, income tax payments automatically recover. Fewer people will qualify for unemployment insurance, so unemployment insurance payments and those benefits will decrease automatically, and more people will go off the welfare rolls, and those payments will go down as the economy recovers. So, it can also dampen, a recovery in that sense also. So it overall kind of takes the business cycle which, maybe it would have looked like this, and it kind of dampens the business cycle so that maybe instead, it looks something like this. Just dampens the magnitude of it, both on the upswing and on the downswing. So, what we can see is that over time, good policy, both monetary and fiscal policy with automatic stabilizers, really has managed to dampen the business cycle. Right? So we could see the very large fluctuations in GDP before World War II, back in the era before modern macroeconomics existed. So this is before demand management types of policies. Very large fluctuations in GDP. And what we see in the post-war period is that even though we're facing, really unusual economic crisis right now, which has little to do with, it has little to do with economic, policy as a cause. It's just the virus is a virus, and we have to deal with it in the best way that we can. But we had a big recession in the early 1980s right here, and we had a big recession, the Great Recession that started in financial markets here. So there have been some pretty substantial economic downturns and hardships over the post-war period. But overall, the economy is considerably more stable than it was before the era of modern macroeconomics, which is encouraging and a fairly nice note to end the semester on. Oh, I should just mention here, I suppose, this is what's called in your textbook the active demand management era. So from post-war till about 1980 and the big recession of 1980, that was where we had stagflation here in the 70s. Pretty tough time in terms of unemployment in the late 70s, and at the same time high inflation. Right, some big recession here, got a recession here, associated both of these with higher inflation. That stagflation built into high inflationary expectations, and we saw high Fed funds rates up around 20% to slow that inflation down, and that led to a very sharp recession in the early 1980s, the Volcker disinflation. And it's really over this period and those episodes that caused classical economists to have a resurgence of their ideas, like Ricardian equivalence became in vogue again after the stagflation of the late 1970s, and there was more active debate between what a school that called themselves New Classical Economists and Keynesians, and then in response to that debate, Keynesians developed a school called New Keynesian Economics. So now we have New Keynesian Economics and New Classical Economics, and they actually agree on a lot more than you might expect that they would. And one thing that they both agree on is that you cannot use fiscal and monetary policy, again, to fine-tune the economy. So after 1980, the idea of using these things to fine-tune the economy was abandoned, and we had this modern period where there's this neoclassical synthesis, this aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Economists, whether they're new classicals and new Keynesians, agree on the basic structure of the model, and a lot of the times agree on the policy prescriptions from the model also. Okay, so again, just to the point of the previous slide that I just made, I think pretty well, you can't use fiscal policy to fine-tune the economy. That's what we believe in the modern era. So the economy is usually, like I said, in an ambiguous state where we should really just balance the budget. If the economy falls into a deep recession, as it did in 2008, and as we know that it is doing right now, then yeah, fiscal policy is definitely warranted. And probably whether you are a new classical, even if you're a new classical who deeply believes in Ricardian equivalence, if you believe in Ricardian equivalence, you might say, well, you might as well give it a shot, because what the heck? Ricardian equivalence says that it shouldn't matter, but what if it does matter and will help the economy? You may as well try it. That was the opinion that a lot of new classical economists took during the Great Recession in 2008. They said, well, I don't think fiscal stimulus will help much, but I also believe in Ricardian equivalence to some degree, so it's probably not going to hurt that bad either. Obviously, we're in a deep recession. We should probably do anything that we can to help the economy out. I haven't seen one single economist, new classical or new Keynesian, at this point argue that the fiscal stimulus is unwarranted or that the Fed's move to lower interest rates to zero is unwarranted. But again, large consistent deficits do lead to large debt, and a large debt makes using fiscal policy a challenge when it is needed. So over time, I would say that both the Democrats and the Republicans, both in Congress and when they have the White House, have not been responsible in their deficit spending. Right? When Republicans are in the White House, they like to cut taxes, but it's unpopular to cut spending. When Democrats have been in the White House, you can actually look at the data and see that there's no increases in taxes because, that's politically unpopular. But at the same time, they tend to increase spending on different government programs. And so if you think about it, really, Democrats and Republicans are equally responsible for the large debt to GDP ratio, even though they might pursue different ways of, different policies that create that large debt to GDP ratio. And that makes the effectiveness of fiscal policy when we need it, for example, today, makes it somewhat less certain that it will have all the desired effects or the full potential effects that it could have on the economy to help stabilize aggregate demand. So I wanted to go into that. That's kind of the end of the discussion from the textbook. But just briefly, to kind of put all this together, this is what I believe would be a good representation of what the economy looked like going, maybe 5 weeks ago, before COVID-19 really showed up here in the United States. There were maybe some disruptions to aggregate supply in the domestic economy because in China, our supply chain is closely integrated with the Chinese supply chain, which is being impacted by the virus, but it hadn't showed up really in the United States. And most economists would agree, I think, that we were very close to potential GDP at that point in time. The unemployment rate was low at around 3.5%. Inflation was relatively low. And economic growth, while I wouldn't call it robust, was just a little bit over 2%, which is probably the most, that we can hope for given what we see in terms of productivity growth. And so the economy was probably here about 5 weeks ago. And then when COVID-19 really hit and social distancing started, what happened, I think, was two major shifts in the economy. One of them, and the most important, was the shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve. Certainly, there's also, you can see the impact of negative expectations in the stock market. And as people's wealth is wiped out, we know that will cause a shift in the aggregate demand curve back to the left, so I'm showing that here. But really, when you tell everybody that they have to stay home, or when you tell, at least, a fifth of the workforce that they have to stay home, they have to socially distance, they can't show up at work, they have no way of working from home, then you're talking about a massive shift to the left in the aggregate supply curve. And that really, I think, is the dominant force that is at work in the economy right now. Yes, aggregate demand is shifting to the left, but that's not the main reason for the large recessionary gap that's currently opening up. It is the social distancing and the fact that people simply cannot show up to work. So you will notice that I have not only drawn the short-run aggregate supply curve shifting to the left, I have shown it becoming steeper. And what that means is that even if you had a large stimulus to aggregate demand, you would have a relatively small impact on actual output relative to prices, because no matter how much we demand, if people can't show up to work, then they simply can't show up to work to supply those goods and services and meet that increase in demand. So we must not only show the aggregate supply curve shifting to the left, but we must show it becoming steeper. In fact, I've shown it becoming steeper to the degree that within any reasonable range of aggregate demand, we're not going to be able to achieve full employment again. So this leads to a very large recessionary gap. So I believe that the shock is both to aggregate demand and aggregate supply simultaneously, but the most important shock is to short-run aggregate supply, and it is not only becoming, it's not only shifting to the left by a large degree, it's also becoming relatively inelastic. And then, in response, the government has these tools of fiscal and monetary policy in order to try to manipulate aggregate demand. And so what they've done is they've lowered interest rates to zero, committed to unconventional monetary policy, and we know past a $2 trillion stimulus. I think that at best, we can expect that stimulus and those aggregate demand side policies to, at best, shift aggregate demand back out to its original position, in which case we would definitely have a smaller recessionary gap than we would have without those policies. So I think those policies are a good idea, but you can still see that we have a very large recessionary gap that opens up even after implementing those policies and shifting the aggregate demand curve back to the right. So while I am fully in support of all those policies, I would suspect that we will still see a very large impact on the macroeconomy and a very deep recession that results from the social distancing. And how long it takes for the SAS curve to snap back to its original position and for the economy to recover and close this recessionary gap, I believe will be a function of how long it takes for the social distancing to end. In other words, if we end social distancing relatively quickly, then the recovery will be relatively quick. But if social distancing lasts for 6 months or more, then it will be more disruptive to supply chains, it will be more disruptive to labor markets, and it will take a longer time for the economy to recover when we ultimately end the social distancing requirements. So I guess in close, what I would say is that not only for the sake of public health, which I'm sure is the more important consideration right now, but also for the sake of a faster economic recovery, when we get the virus beat and we can go back to work, the faster we can do that, the better it will be in terms of a fast recovery. And so it is important to recognize that those social distancing requirements and stay home, so that we can actually end those requirements sooner rather than later. So that's sort of, I'll end the course with that public service announcement. Be well and stay safe. I hope you have a great summer. Study hard for the final exam and attend my office hours and get in touch with me if you have any questions about this video or any of the other videos as you get ready to wrap up the semester. Thank you.